talking about Hebron, this is a city that was important for the Kahanists to establish deep roots in because of its holiness to Jews and to Muslims, and they were among the most hardcore settlers and among the first settlers to settle Khalil, or they eventually to the settlement that they established next to Hebron, Kiryat Arba. It was a strong base of support for Kahana and has been ever since, but if you can imagine that even the Kahanists were more radical than the local settlers, which were the most extreme of the settlers in the settlement movement. So for the hardcore Kahana movement, they decided Kiryat Arba wasn't right-wing enough, and they decided to establish an outpost of Kiryat Arba. This is the first settlement outpost in Israeli history. And among those who founded this settlement outpost were Baruch ben Yosef and Israel Fuchs and Bob and Rochelle Manning, all American-born Jews who followed Kahana to Israel. And the settlement outpost that they founded was called El Nakam, which means God avenged, or God of vengeance. And these founders of El Nakam were, according to all the FBI agents that I interviewed, were the assassins of Alex Odeh. The Mannings, Israel Fuchs, and Baruch ben Yosef. So that is why I call them the El Nakam bombers. Now, of course, we're talking about the Kahanists, and there were many Kahanist killers, and there were many people killed by Kahanists over the years, dozens in number. Today we're only going to talk about one of them, Alex Odeh. I don't need to tell you too many details, but just very briefly, we're talking about a Palestinian man who grew up in the West Bank, in the village of Jifna, and he moves to the United States, becomes an American citizen, and raises a family here. And in October 1985, his office is exploded when he walks in. And immediately, the number one suspects in his murder are the Jewish Defense League, the Kahanists, the Kahanist group founded by Meir Kahana. At that time, the JDL is considered by the FBI to be the number 2 domestic terrorist threat. By the end of the year, the FBI publishes a report saying that they're the number 1. The Jewish supremacists are the number 1 domestic terrorist threat in the USA in 1985. And the heads of the Kahana movement in North America at that time, who spearheaded the assassination and plotted and planned it, were the JDL national chairman, Irv Rubin, and his lieutenant, Earl Krugel. So, just to give you the most basic grounding so we understand who the players are, we're going to look at a map of the world and we're going to divide it into 3 panels so we can follow the action as it goes from coast to coast. We got the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast and the Mediterranean coast. And it's between these 3 areas of operation. And of course, I don't need to explain here, civilian area, military occupation. The West Bank is under occupation, so you just understand what we're looking at. And as I said, Alex Odeh grows up in Jifna, outside Ramallah. He moves to the United States. The Mannings come up here in Los Angeles. Andrew Green, later to be known as Baruch ben Yosef, and Keith Fuchs, they grow up in New York. Fuchs actually moves out to LA, and then all of them move to the occupied territories, into Kiryat Arba, and to establish El Nakam. So I'm just going to, now we've got a timeline on top so that we can follow the action. So we're all on board. So the year is 1984. Kahana has just been elected to the Knesset for the first time. Because of this, he has to give up his American citizenship. Under Israeli law, you cannot both be a member of Knesset and still hold a foreign citizenship. But because he no longer has American citizenship, he can't really run the Kahanist organization in the USA. He can't continue to be the head of the Jewish Defense League. And so he has to pass the baton over, and he crowns the next leader, the national chairman, Irv Rubin, the head of the JDL out here in California. For Rubin, Alex Odeh is his nemesis. He's probably the most outspoken or one of the most passionate defenders of Palestinian people and Arab American people. At that time, we're talking, he's the regional director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. And so Rubin targets him for assassination. Now, this isn't off the mark. This isn't hard to believe. They consistently committed terrorist attacks going back years, for more than a decade. For example, in 1972, when there was a terrorist attack at Israel's national airport in Lid, in response to it, Rubin and Krugel and JDL members set off a bomb in a bank in Los Angeles. And then a few years later, there's later on there's a terrorist attack. Rather, in the same year, 1972, there's a terrorist attack in Germany at the Munich Olympics, and several Israeli athletes are killed there. Rubin decides he's going to get revenge for this, and he plants a bomb at the home of a local Palestinian American activist. Along with them is Robert Manning, one of the El-Nakam bombers, before he moves to Palestine. Manning quoted as saying to local media, "I just bombed an Arab's house in Hollywood. No Arab is going to be safe in this country." And so they're arrested on these charges. And then again, 1985, there's a terrorist attack. There's a hijacking of a ship in the Mediterranean, a cruise ship called the Achille Lauro, and one of its passengers, a Jewish American man, is killed. And because of that, that's the trigger that Rubin says, okay, now I will assassinate a Palestinian in response. And that's why he decided to assassinate Alex Odeh. Now, for some people, this might be like coming as a surprise. What? A man like Irv Rubin? I thought that he was a respectable member of society. You're trying to tell me that he plotted murder? Yes, he plotted murder. Go back to 1976. There's an episode of 60 Minutes where Dan Rather exposed the fact that, and played recordings in which Irv Rubin's voice is heard, plotting to pay someone, a mercenary, to assassinate PLO leader Yasser Arafat. And you hear him on the tape saying, the state of Israel would love to see this man die. Every Jew would love to see this man die. So yes, this is definitely part of his MO. Now, at that point, 1985, the El-Nakam bombers are on the East Coast, in the New York area. And that's where they're committing a series of bombings. Up in Boston, a bomb that they set off horribly injured a police officer who tried to defuse it when they tried to bomb the ADC offices in Boston. And a bomb in Brentwood took off the legs of this man, rock and roll drummer, Rob Seyfried. And they killed a Muslim man in the New Jersey area, Paterson, New Jersey, Cherem Subzakov. So they already had committed a bombing run, a fatal bombing run on the East Coast with several victims. And now Irv Rubin invites the El-Nakam bombers to come out to the West Coast. And that's when they assassinate Alex Odeh and blow up the ADC offices where he worked. Of course, medical teams tried to save him, but were unable to, and he died in the hospital hours later. What was the response from Irv Rubin, national chairman of the JDL? Straight up, no shame, saying to the press, no Jew or American should shed one tear for the destruction of a PLO front. The person or persons responsible for this bombing deserves our praise. I have no tears for Mr. Odeh. He got exactly what he deserves. Of course, at that point, they're generating suspicion. They want to take credit for it. They want to enjoy the support of Jewish supremacists for this terrorist act, but at the same time, they don't want to be arrested by the FBI. So with the caveat, he says, we had nothing to do with the bombings. Then once he starts to get the attention of the FBI looking in his direction, he tries to divert it. If a minute ago he was saying that this was obviously an act by, implying that it was Jews who killed him, he then says, well, my theory is that they, the Arabs, wanted a martyr and blew this poor guy away. He had the chutzpah to try to blame Odeh's assassination on other Arab Americans. This man, Odeh, has become a martyr, and the FBI is laying it on our doorstep. They're killing us. They are killing us. Fast forward 1994, a statue of Alex Odeh is, Alex Odeh is honored with a statue outside Santa Ana Public Library. And at the dedication ceremony, Helena, who's here in the audience, says that Irv Rubin came right up to her. He attended that event, and he walked right up to her, looked me straight in the face, and told me my father deserved to die. A couple years later, 1996, the FBI puts out an announcement saying that it's willing to pay $1 million for anyone who has information that could lead to the conviction of Alex Odeh's killers. In response, Irv Rubin calls this, saying it's an ongoing vendetta sponsored by the Arab community to get Jewish people. This is how sick it gets, inverting reality, claiming to be the victim. And of course, the following year, the statue is spray painted blood red with lines going across his wrists and his neck. And Irv Rubin steps up and says that he's disgusted by the statue. I think the guy is a war criminal. So this is Irv Rubin. Now, I came into this story trying to make heads or tails, trying to understand what actually happened and why these killers have never been brought to justice. So I sought out representatives of local police, and I was able to track down this man, Hugh Mooney, of the Santa Ana Police Department, now retired. And I interviewed Mr. Mooney. He, in fact, was the first police officer to arrive at the scene of the crime. So he has very sharp recollections about what happened that day. And this is what he told me. I responded up there to take partial command of the scene, talking about the ADC offices. The FBI was there within 30 minutes of the explosion. We were there wondering what was going on. No sense of why this had happened. And then a helicopter landed at a field next door. Turned out to be the FBI and LAPD. They knew what happened and who did it and who the target was. They told us right off. So already from minute one, the FBI had its top suspects. So what happened? Why weren't they arrested? Well, according to Mooney, the FBI, these agents who met him after they walked off the helicopter said, they're en route to Los Angeles. Notify the LA office. They were following them out west. Remember, they had committed the bombing run on the East Coast. And because of this, the FBI was already onto them. And so they followed them out here when they flew out west via Minneapolis. And they said, they're en route, notify LA. And when they got to the LAX airport, Mooney says they missed them at the airport. They were scrambling everybody looking for them. And then boom. The explosion. They missed them again. Mooney describes the days that followed and the police work that they did, the diligent police work, to try to put it together. He says that the bomb squad spent 2.5 days collecting fragments all across the street. And he says that the wire signature was identical to the bomb back east. So they knew, they had the proof that these guys were the same ones, the same bombers, the same assassins. The color, the size, the gauge, the way it was wrapped and tied. Everything was identical. After this, the El Nakam bombers fly back to the East Coast. And when they got back to New York, Mooney says, the NYPD especially wanted to arrest them. And they were told, no, just keep them under surveillance. They kept their surveillance right up till they walked onto the plane and back to Israel. We were told by the US attorney that we could not go arrest them. Who was the US attorney at that time? Rudy Giuliani. We'll see what he has to say. In any case, I then tracked down FBI agents who'd worked on the case. And I was able to find Neil Herman, one of the most highly decorated supervisors in FBI history. He was the agent who carried out the investigation into, among other infamous cases, the first World Trade Center bombing. And so he's a high-ranking supervisor of the Joint Terrorism Task Force that investigated the murders on the East Coast and on the West Coast. He had been monitoring them on the East, and this is what Neil Herman recollects from that time. He says that Green, now we're talking about Baruch Ben Yosef, the name he took when he moved to Israel, Green and Manning and Fuchs, we were aware of their travels. From the mid-early 1980s to 1990, there was a massive investigation into these men. The fascination with those three was their background training with the Israelis, meaning in the Israeli army. Green, Ben Yosef actually served in a commando unit in the Israeli army. On one hand, they were our allies, talking about the Israeli government now. But if they had operated as a rogue group, it would be a great embarrassment. Was it the government? Were they on their own? Getting information from the Israelis was always difficult, he says. Now, of course, they have close cooperation between the American government and the Israeli law enforcement agencies. So he says that it was General Caspi who was the point person. General Caspi, Yoshua Caspi, he at that time was Israel's police attaché to the United States, and he was based in New York. And that's who Herman would seek out when he needed information about Israeli criminals entering the US. And Caspi, before he served in that capacity, he had for many years been the police chief of Jerusalem, okay, which the Southern Command, which also included Khalil, also included Hebron in his purview. And so he had to have known about these guys because he himself was responsible for, amongst other things, securing the holy places, including in Jerusalem, including in 1980 when Kahana and Ben Yosef plotted to blow up the Dome of the Rock. So Caspi should have known very well who these people were. But when he was in New York, according to Neil Herman, he says, I knew him for 10 years, talking about General Caspi, and that he was very cooperative whenever it had to do with anything else. If it was just a economic crime that was committed by Israeli nationals. He helped me in the Bureau on many cases separate from those. But when it came time to give up information on the El Nakam bombers, according to Herman, Caspi would only speak to him in riddles. So that was a dead end. Now, I managed to track down Mr. Caspi. He's now over 90 years old. He lives in an old age home not too far from where I live. So I sought him out and I interviewed him in his home. And according to him, he says that it wasn't he who was responsible for that dialogue with the FBI. He foists it on Yossi Ginosar, who at that time was the Shin Bet attaché. The Shin Bet is Israel's FBI. So he says, no, it wasn't me. You got the wrong guy. I mean, that's what Herman says it's you. No. It wasn't me. It was Yossi Ginosar, the Shin Bet attaché to the US. Frankly, this doesn't make any sense because the Shin Bet's job in the US is a different job altogether. The job there is to secure airports from which planes fly to Israel. It's to secure the lives of Israeli politicians that visit the United States, just like when Ariel Sharon visited the US at that time. But it also is extremely unlikely because just a few months after he began his term here, he had to fly back to Israel because he was implicated in this scandal that I won't go into any details about, but the Bus 400 scandal. And so he quickly left that post and returned to Israel and did different operations there. So it's an easy person to pin it on because Ginosar is, first of all, he's mired in controversy. And second, he's dead now, so there's no one to talk to about it. But okay, let's say the Shin Bet had something to do with it. So I went to the top of the Shin Bet, and I interviewed the former head of the Shin Bet, Carmi Gilon. Now, Gilon told me that he'd monitored these men in the 80s when Gilon was not just a member of an agent of the Shin Bet. He was actually appointed to be the first head of the Jewish department. Of course, most of the Shin Bet's activities are to try to foil Palestinian militant attacks, but he was appointed to be the first head of the Jewish department, the part of the Shin Bet that tried to stop Jewish terrorism. And so he very well knew the El Nakam bombers back in the 1980s and in the 1990s, when he was then promoted to be the head of the Shin Bet. So he knew these men very well. And what he told me, I interviewed him in his home outside Jerusalem. And what he told me was, I really don't know about that. I swear on my life, I'm hearing it for the first time, talking about that these men were involved in an assassination on US soil. He says, I never heard of it. I didn't know that Baruch Ben Yosef, ever returned to the US after he'd moved to the West Bank. He goes on to say, Israel worked very well with the Americans since the time of Khrushchev. So there were close contacts between Israeli and American officials all those years, since the 1950s. But he says that all those years, Israel never transferred information about Jews like the JDL. So only if it had nothing to do with nationalistic motive. During my time, there was no cooperation at all on Jewish issues. Carmi Gilon retired from the Shin Bet in 1996. So up until that point, American officials were definitely not getting any help from Israeli officials on this murder case or any other political assassination.